out there and what they would have to give up. Doesn't feel like the Pelicans are going to come off Anthony Davis. I don't see where DeMarcus Cousins makes them any better. We just talked about Kawhi Leonard. If he's not available, it just feels like, why not take a swing at LeBron?
It is interesting if Kyrie is, I hadn't heard that, but if he's threatening to walk, it brings you a little bit more grace and mercy to LeBron out of that Cavaliers situation, because, Kyrie was supposed to be like this, the next guy in Boston to be the superstar there. If he's already after a year threatening to walk, that's kind of a bad look for him.
Yeah, I don't think I haven't heard that he's threatening to walk. It's just from the organization. It just feels like those drips and drabs that get out into the media of, I'm hearing that Boston's kind of got some concern if Kyrie's going to re-sign with him, or they're not sure if he's going to re-sign. And a lot of these guys, because of the way the contracts work, specifically for a guy like Klay Thompson, if he re-signs this year, he can only max out at 108. If he waits 1 year, it's 188. So these guys are not really incentivized to sign a year early and give their teams sort of that flexibility to be able to go out. They sort of put them on the hook of like, well, I might resign, I might go out and test the market. Why play that game when you could get the best player in the game?
Yeah.
Well, that's a wrap for segment 1. We'll come back with segment 2. We have a couple stories to hit. Did the 76ers have to make the move to force Brian Colangelo to resign after his story broke? We'll talk about the World Cup, and we'll finish it up talking about the U.S. Open. It's segment 2, so it's talk-worthy time, and unfortunately we have to talk about our 76ers and not in the best of lights. Eric, this story came out, and sometimes I text you and say sometimes it feels like this part of our job is too easy because the content sort of writes itself in manners that it's almost unbelievable that here you have the son of one of the best-known personalities and sort of this mantra around the Colangelo family, and now you have a veteran GM that's been around the block. It starts to come to surface from a report by The Ringer that Brian Colangelo is somehow involved in having these burner accounts, which was a story that came out last summer with Kevin Durant, that he had other accounts that he would sort of... It's such a stupid story, I can't even not laugh. But that Kevin Durant would come out and basically defend himself against Twitter trolls using these accounts. And
people thought LeBron's psyche was weak.
Yeah.
Kevin Durant's on there like, hey, Kevin, you're awesome. You're really cool.
Kevin Durant's my favorite player. I hate Russell Westbrook. But then you see Brian Colangelo now, this basketball mind. We talk about, we talk about the youth of players making mistakes. Here's a veteran GM that has, what better job could you want than GM of the 76ers with what they've gone through and now where they're at? And then you have burner accounts supposedly attached to you where you're attacking the stars of your team, going after Embiid and Fultz, talking about Okafor and Nerlens Noel and basically their tradability and some of the factors that could cause them to fail physicals, and Noel's a punk, and all this different stuff starts coming out. Obviously, we just talked about the Sixers as being in play for LeBron. Well, you certainly can't have your organization involved in that type of stuff with the guy leading the charge in terms of recruitment for LeBron involved in that. Sixers do an internal investigation. It turns out these accounts are somehow linked to Colangelo's wife, although if you read some of the tweets, it certainly seems like he's involved in those tweets. But Eric, this was one of the most insane stories I've ever heard, especially coming from the GM of a franchise, one that we like, one that we follow very closely. Colangelo resigned last week, but was this a move where he either resigned or the Sixers fired him?
Oh, absolutely. Our group of friends that like the Sixers here in this area, we were going back and forth about it, and they were just beside themselves that he hadn't been fired immediately. And I said, look, in this day and age, there's a lot of people getting fired for accusations. You get, accused of the Me Too thing, you get fired. You get accused of this, you get fired. You get accused of that, you get fired. So I wanted to be careful that, we don't want to build a society that every time
go through due process.
You get accused of something, you get fired. You want a due process. It's the same issue I had with the Ezekiel Elliott suspensions over and over last year. And I still feel like Ezekiel should never have been suspended because you don't want to build precedent for punishing people for accusations. There needs to be a due process. Now, with that said, the trust level there had been broken. And so you do get to a point where whether this is proven to be true or proven to be alleged or proven to be just very suspicious, there had been a great deal of trust lost there between the organization, Brian Colangelo, and especially your players. And so I'm just going to cut you real straight here, Justin. When you have a Sixers team that made leaps and bounds of a better finish this year than the years prior, and you have forward momentum going in the right direction, you cannot let your GM be in any way, shape, or form bringing that down. You've got to give Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, and all of your future draft picks the confidence that you come to this organization and we will believe in you. So I'm sorry, but he had to be either fired or encouraged to resign, because even if it's not true, that trust was gone.
Once they did the investigation and the numbers and everything linked back to him, to his family, no matter what it is, like you said, it's gone. A lot of the media talk has been, how does this affect free agency? The bigger point is you still have stars on your team. You still have Ben Simmons. You still have Joel Embiid. You can't alienate those guys as well, because if they're not engaged into this franchise, we've already seen that can be issues. These guys could force trades. The whole thing could have come apart. They had to get rid of him, and at that point, you cannot have him coming out and attacking your players. That's a bad look, and it's also, it's a bad look when you start to go into free agency. It's a bad look when you're trying to draft players. They had to get rid of him. They had to do it now so this team can get the ship righted before the draft comes, before free agency opened. We saw last year in Cleveland what happened when they didn't bring back David Griffin. All hell broke loose, basically. They made a bad trade for Kyrie Irving. It seemed like the organization was in a complete free fall. LeBron sees his guy out the door. They had to do it, Eric.
And that may have been the first step for LeBron not finishing his career in Cleveland.
Yeah, that seemed to be one of the first dominoes that sort of took this season and just put it in this whirlwind, because then LeBron comes out and says he didn't want Kyrie Irving traded, and Dan Gilbert may have been involved in that. That's a whole different story. But now David Griffin is sitting out there, Eric, as a free agent. I read a tweet from Adrian Wojnarowski just saying that this job is coveted by nearly everyone that's available. They want to find their way into Philly as the GM. So do you feel like if David Griffin comes there, that increases the chances that LeBron would?
I can't see how that would be a bad thing. It certainly
can't hurt.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely helps, because if Griffin is in some way, shape, or form LeBron's guy, his choice as GM, the other thing is it shows the players that are currently in Philly that the ownership is committed to them as players, that they're not going to stand behind GMs monkeying around with all this other stuff. If they bring in a guy like Griffin, who has been proven to be doing good jobs, if he operates above board and everything is copacetic there, I think it just continues that momentum. You had a little bump in the road, but I think everybody is happy at that point, and it might help your recruiting efforts with LeBron.
All right, well, let's kick it over now that the NBA is done, and we got a couple weeks here before the draft and free agency kicks off. Eric, we were going over our pre-show notes before we recorded, and you brought up the weirdest topic that I've ever heard in talking about your international sourcing for this World Cup. So I'll throw it to you. Are you excited for the World Cup, and who do you have as your favorite this year?
Believe it or not, I actually love the World Cup. Now, I don't get to talk soccer, or as our English and European listeners say, football. They actually say football and American football when they're talking to me about sports.
So wait a minute, when they start talking football and football to you, do you get them confused and just immediately start talking about the Eagles and really just derail the conversation?
Well, sometimes, except actually a lot of them, they are fans of American football. They're fans of the NFL. And so they start talking to me about Miami Dolphins and other. So it's because some of them are Dolphins fans.
Must not be that big of a fans of the NFL.
So it's a crazy conversations. But when they talk to me about football being soccer, I'm completely lost most of the time. But the World Cup is something that I have actually followed in years past. It's a very enjoyable event. Unfortunately, the United States is not in the World Cup this year, nor are some other past champions like Italy. So this year, and I know we're not going to sit here and talk soccer. We're not going to sit here and talk names and players. So Justin, I just wanted to ask you kind of a couple of quick things. Brazil is the heavy favorite. They're 4-1 favorites to win the World Cup, followed by defending champion Germany at 9-2, and then the champion from 2 times ago, Spain, at 11-2, and then France. Those are your 4 powerhouses in the World Cup, and you've got names like Neymar and Müller and Griezmann, and names that would be household names if we followed soccer. Now, right underneath that are the sort of dark horses that people are looking at. My friend Pablo from Spain, he actually was saying, watch out for Argentina. And they're a 9-1 they have Messi on their team. And then you've got Belgium. For my guys, Craig Thomas, Jamie Gale, those guys that are trying to teach me everything I can possibly learn about EPL and these Champions Leagues and, other parts of soccer in England. England's a 16-1. So, hey, and by the way, Justin, in case you wondered who out of the 32 teams has the worst odds, Saudi Arabia and Panama come in at 750-1. So
well, I have to be in Delaware this week, so maybe I'll go put a bet on Saudi Arabia for $10.
Go put $10 on Saudi Arabia and see if they get through the tables.
7,500. We can get some good swag for the studio.
The World Cup is exciting because you've got group stages and then you've got bracket. And so if you are a fan of sports, the way that the World Cup operates, if you actually, if the NFL playoffs did it like this, it would be fantastically entertaining. So that's part of what appeals to the World Cup. So Justin, we're not going to sit here, like I said, talk about who might win or what team is the favorite because we just don't know enough about it. But I'm going to watch. I'm going to watch the games. I'm going to continue to try to learn about soccer. What I like about soccer is the art of it, the fact that a 0-0 game can actually be tremendously entertaining because in the 88th minute, if you get, a score, it's just like a big touchdown in a 45-45 NFL game. It has the same effect. Or extra time being added or penalty kicks. The game of soccer has its own art form with it that I really actually enjoy. It's very much like hockey in that way because the way that the ball moves around the field is similar to the way the puck moves around the rink. As disorganized as it looks, it's actually the complete opposite. It's very organized. But Justin, I got to ask you, we laugh about it because soccer in this country just doesn't resonate yet. Why is that? Why does soccer, MLS, there are MLS teams all over the place now. Philadelphia has the Philadelphia Union. So if I were going to follow the MLS on a weekly basis, I would root for the Philadelphia Union because that aligns with my other fandom. But why doesn't it resonate with us? Why did we never feel like soccer was one of the major four sports in this country?
It just feels like from a U.S. standpoint, this country hasn't valued soccer the way. Even I'm interested with the U.S. not being in the World Cup, what type of numbers and ratings that it gets, because it felt like the last World Cup, the U.S. was viable and it gave the country something to sort of get behind. But outside of that, it's not something that we really follow. It's not something that pops up on ESPN. It's not something that gets covered unless there's something crazy that happens. A dude kicks the other one between the legs or something gets hit in the head or something, or, there's a stadium that gets firebombed.
By the way, if you want to see flopping, watch World Cup soccer.
Yeah, and then you have the flopping side of it as well. So it just doesn't feel like a sport that, is really on the map enough. When it is on the map, a lot of people do get behind the U.S., and it's the one time the country actually doesn't all seem to hate each other. We actually all sort of root for the same team for one time. So it's kind of disappointing that the U.S. didn't qualify this year. But outside of that, it just doesn't feel like soccer's really on the radar. And now from the fact that, from a European side in the Premier League, that's where the stars are and things. But even then, with Ronaldo and Messi and some of those guys, it's just names. And you just watch the highlights like, oh, okay, that was a great, but you don't really watch the rest of it. And even the games are sort of shorter. It's not like you have to sit for 4 hours and watch it. But I do think the fact that, for a lot of America, especially that's football fans or basketball, when you have a 0-0 game and you invest an hour and a half into it or more, that doesn't always move the needle here in this country because a lot of people don't see the art of it or some of the other things that you talk about from a strategic standpoint. So I don't really ever see it be that big until the country gets soccer sort of built up on a national level where you get stars and the MLS becomes, more of our day-to-day conversations. But we've been doing the show for over a year now with almost 60 episodes. This is the first time I think we've ever talked soccer. So that should just show you on really the pantheon of where things are. It's even behind hockey, and they really only have their run when it's the Stanley Cup Finals. So that's where I really feel it is in the U.S.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. A lot of this conversation comes from some of our dedicated listeners that are over in the European countries. And yes, we actually do have listeners in many countries all over the world. And one of our listeners, Craig Thomas over in England, he emails me, texts me a lot about the fact that, he just tries to get an insight as to, well, in America, what's it like to be and we talk about IndyCar and F1 and things like that they actually experience in a different way than we do over here. And soccer is the same way. EPL and Championship League, it is huge over there. And also, soccer, what we don't see here in the United States is that soccer is a universal language. Football, as they call it in most of the other countries in the world, it is the biggest sport